We're going to walk through how to create a progression of learning in Algebra Honors. So I've accessed the Sumner GVC links, and I've accessed the Algebra Honors course. I was looking for a robust unit in here. I found quarter 3 linear functions. So over here in the state standards column, we have listed the standards associated with that unit. A common organizer I use right here to organize our standards and start to unpack them into targets. So the first thing is just we got to copy and paste the standards so we can look at them all together in a unit. So we'll go over here to the GVC and we will copy each one of the state standards. Just a few mouse clicks as we get everything copied over. I think it's important to copy over the standards to make sure you don't miss something, especially if you start to piece out the standard from one document to the organizer. By copying them, you can make sure that you hit all the components of the standards. All right, looks like that was the last standard, so we'll go back to the organizer. I'm going to put some spaces in there to make sure I can see the different standards here. All right, so the first thing we want to do is when we identify the targets from the standards is look for the chunks of information in each standard. So some things I look for is like on this first one right here where it says calculate and interpret the average rate of change of a function. Presented symbolically or as a table over a specific interval. I see calculate as one thing I'm going to do and then interpret. So I see those as two different targets right there. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that twice. The first thing I want students to be able to do is they're going to calculate the average rate. So I'm going to delete where it says and interpret. And then some things we can include in here is we can put some bullet points on exactly how they're going to show. They're going to show it both symbolically. So just kind of a nice checklist for the teachers and the students, and as a table as well. And then on the second one now that they're able to calculate, we want them to interpret in exactly the same. All right, we'll go back up here. You notice I deleted off where it said over a specific interval. Not necessarily important for the target. Something as a teacher would need to know when they're teaching. Also, at the end of this standard said estimate the rate of change from a graph. I see that as another target that we're going to add. So again, copy that. We're going to paste it right down there. So right away from that one standard, we have 3 targets written. We'll go to the next standard. It says write a function that describes the relationship between 2 quantities. That whole thing right there, 1 target. So we'll just copy and paste that one down. Can't really break that up into anything else. We'll go to the next one. It says create equations in 2 or more variables to represent relationships between quantities. Graph equations on a coordinate axis with labels and scales. So I see 2 targets split up right there. So create equations in 2 or more variables to represent relations between quantities. And then also we have graph equations on coordinate axes with labels and scales. So I'll copy that as well. Now, one thing for Algebra Honors, a lot of these standards are written as the same standards for high school. So actually in this class, we're not going to do more variables, so it's just going to be 2 variables. So sometimes we can strike that out or delete that where it says or more. And we'll see that in another one. and sometimes the standards will say equations and inequalities, where if your unit's just working in equations, you'd want to scratch out the inequalities part. All right. Looks like we got all from that standard. We'll go next to the next standard. It says recognize situations in which one quantity changes at a constant rate per unit relative to another. Again, that is one certain thing that students need to be able to do, so we can't really break that apart. I'm going to insert a row. All right, and our last standard right here says prove the slope criteria for parallel and perpendicular lines and use them to solve geometric problems. Example, find the equation of a line parallel or perpendicular to a given line that passes through a given point. So really the target we're going to get from that highlighted portion, this just helps explain that target a little bit more. But I see two things. First thing is we have to prove the criteria for parallel and perpendicular lines, and then we also have to use the slope to solve geometric problems. So let's go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to split that into two targets right there. So the first one is, again, prove the slope criteria for parallel and perpendicular lines. And then it's going to be use, I'm going to put use what? Use the slope criteria. That's what they mean by them, to solve geometric problems. So let me clean this up a little bit. All right, so go back up there. We have all of our standards covered in our targets. We can start to identify some of the declarative knowledge. What is it that students will need to know? So some of the vocab words here, like function. And the way to do this is really, I'm going to look at all the targets and hit some of those vocab words that students need to be able to calculate the average rate. So average rate. Go down to the second target right here. We've already taken care of that. Estimate the rate of change. So probably rate of change is going to be one. Write a function that describes a relationship between two quantities. Function we've already got up there. Create equations in two variables to represent the relationship between quantities. Probably got that. Might put variables in there. Graph equations on a coordinate axis with labels and scales. That's all language they should know from previous grade levels. Recognize situations which quantity changes at a constant rate per unit. So constant rate is probably one, and then rate per unit. I'm going to split those up. So constant rate, and then also rate per unit. Relative to another. Prove the slope criteria for parallel and perpendicular lines. I'm going to put slope criteria in there as well. And use the slope criteria to solve geometric problems. So that should be all the declarative knowledge. Again, we can fill that box up as we start to fill in the gaps later along the process. But right now, we would want to go back to our Sumner GVC links, and our math GVC for Algebra Honors, and see how that work that we just did matches with the skills we have listed in our GVC and also our key vocabulary that we have listed in our GVC.